Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this informational webinar on the ARPA funds from the Department of Economic Development. With us today, we have Taylor Mazdra. She is a senior project manager with the Department of Economic Development here in Missouri, and she's going to talk with us today about the ARPA funds specifically for small businesses. So Taylor, turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sue, too, for joining us today. And of course, welcome to everybody who may be watching this after the fact. You know, we're recording, and that's a super helpful feature nowadays. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have a little presentation here that might help, if nothing else, keep me on track and moving along. But kind of a plan of attack just for what we want to cover here. I'm never sure how familiar everyone is with the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. I know, obviously, I'm very familiar, have become very familiar in the last few months taking on this new role, but prior to that, I had just had a very outside kind of understanding that it was going on, but I didn't know the nitty-gritty details of it. So I'll give a little context on what ARPA is, and then we'll dive into specifically the small business grant that I'm here to talk about today. So for ARPA in general, this is a federal funding program. It was passed in March of 2021. And the state of Missouri got about $2.6 billion. It's billion with a B, so it's a lot of money that the state of Missouri got. The Department of Economic Development did not receive all of that money, as we should not have, but we did receive a good chunk of it, and are putting in place about 9 programs to get that money out across the state. So on this slide here, you can see all the different programs that we have and the current status as of today. What we're looking at there, we have a couple that are already accepting applications, have been built out and are to that phase. A couple that are on the tail end of that, getting ready to launch applications, and so on and so forth. Others drafting guidelines. I will tell you that on some of the grants on the lower end or lower half of this table here, October might be a little ambitious for a couple of them. So beware that all the launch dates are subject to change. And I guess this is a good time now to also say all the information that I share here today is also subject to change because we are currently in the draft guidelines portion of our timeline. You can see there we have a whole timeline that I will go through here more in a minute, but we're not quite to our final guidelines yet. I've drafted up some final guidelines. We're doing some internal reviews, making sure that everything is compliant with our federal regulations that we have to abide by there. So take everything I say today with a little bit of a grain of salt. I'll give you some insight into kind of what changes we're looking potentially at doing in our final guidelines. But of course, you're certainly welcome to view our draft guidelines on our ARPA website. ded.mo.gov/ARPA is where those are housed. But I think I skipped over this program overview, so I definitely want to give that here on the front end because I know sometimes you're short on time, especially if you're watching this back after the fact. So if nothing else, I would really encourage you to stay for the full time and listen in. But if nothing else, these are the key components of this program that you definitely want to know. So the purpose of the small business grant is to provide assistance to our small businesses across the state in the form of reimbursement in response to the negative economic impacts that you all experienced due to the pandemic. We are reimbursing for costs from March 3rd, 2021 through current. You may remember the CARES Act grants that the Department of Economic Development did in 2020. We had folks submitting individual receipts, you getting reimbursements for $57 and $5 here and $300 there. It was politely put a mess. So I'm told it was hard for you as an applicant to collect all those receipts, and it was hard for us as an administrator of these grants to keep everything straight as well. I think they did the best they could with the information they had at the time. You certainly can't ask for more than that. But now we have a lot more contextual knowledge of the best way to handle this grant funding. So we have revamped what the CARES Act grant looks like to be a little bit little bit more user-friendly on both ends of the spectrum there. So this is a first come, first served grant. We have $10 million total in our budget for this to share out there. And your award amount will be determined based off of some information on your tax filings, but you will be eligible, if you're able to prove it, for up to $25,000 for loss demonstrated in revenue or gross receipts. Like I said before, we're looking at an October of 2022 application launch. I'll get into that, I guess, more here with the timeline. So we've drafted our draft guidelines. We had our public comment period, and our focus groups got some really good feedback in that. I think we got 495 comments on that, which is great, more than some of our other programs. So I'm very, very proud of our small businesses across the state and our chambers and other organizational partners. But we're taking all that feedback and working through it to make those final guidelines. We have a first draft of those final ones that are going through some internal review right now. And we're hoping to have those final guidelines posted within the next week or two. Once those final guidelines are published, no later than October 3rd is what we're looking at for those to be published. We'll have 2 weeks of buffer time for you to go through and look through all those information in the guidelines, the eligibility requirements, the required documentation, so on and so forth. You'll have 2 weeks to go through that, and then our applications will open. So we're looking at a mid to late October for those applications to open. Again, all those dates are subject to change, but as of right now, that's what we're looking at there. So into the meat of this program, everybody, of course, wants to know if they're eligible or not. So we have some standard eligibility requirements across our ARPA programs that everyone has to meet those requirements, whether it's providing the proper documentation that if you're a business, you have your tax ID number and so on and so forth, or if you're sole proprietor, we're probably looking for your social on that. But specific to the small business grant, we are looking for for-profit businesses that are, of course, based in Missouri, independently owned and operated, and employing 50 or fewer full-time employees at the time of application. So a full-time employee here is defined as someone who is scheduled to work 35 or more hours per week. And again, that's at the time of application. We have some required documentation there on that as well. We're also looking for folks that have been in operation in the state of Missouri since before January 1st, 2019, and currently operating or in the process of reopening. I will give you a little insider information here, and this is, again, grain of salt, take it with a little asterisk there, but we are looking at changing that 2019 date to 2020. And that will include some more folks across the state. We've gotten some good feedback on that and are just checking to cross our T's and dot our I's that we are able to do that and make it work properly. So that's something that we're looking at changing there. And then we will also have a form or a field on the application where you will have to self-certify that you plan to remain in business through the end of 2023. We want to be good stewards of these funds, and we want to give them out to businesses who are going to stay in business and continue stimulating our economy and making a lasting effect across the state. So that's why that requirement is there. I mentioned the tax information, that standard stuff. The last bullet point on here is for minority and women-owned businesses. We do have a carve out of funds within this $10 million for women and minority-owned businesses. This is something that came out of the task force, the governor's task force during COVID. And so if you are a woman or a minority who owns a business and want to tap into that $2 million that we have reserved for that, we'll just have you self-certify that you are at least 51% owned and controlled by one or more women or minorities. Pretty easy to do, but of course, we don't want anybody fibbing on that. So there's certainly always the opportunity there for some auditing and double checking back on that. But I think that covers the key points of eligible applicants in the draft guidelines, which I think I might have copied here. I might be able to drop it in the chat. Yep, there's the link to the draft guidelines if you're interested in pulling those up while we're going through this. Eligible applicants, I believe, are section 3. And the same with ineligible applicants. So on the flip side of this, we have some standard, again, ineligibility notes there. For example, medical marijuana businesses, this is federal funding. So the federal government isn't too fond of marijuana right now. So we can't share funding with those businesses. Same with, gambling, things of that nature. Chains or franchises. This is a big one that we got a lot of comments on in our public comment survey. We were looking for feedback on that, so we're really thankful to have some additional guidance there. Specifically, we're looking at the number of locations there. You'll see chains or franchises with greater than 10 locations are ineligible. We've received a lot of feedback that that number should be less. So we're looking at potentially lowering that maybe to 5. We'll see where we land with it. But just a little insight there. Nonprofits are ineligible for this grant. They are eligible for the nonprofit grant that we have through ARPA. So if you're a nonprofit that happens to be listening in, go check out the nonprofit grant, please. Governmental entities are eligible for other grants as well. If you're a publicly traded company, that would kick you out of eligibility here. And of course, if you're debarred or suspended from receiving federal funding, we unfortunately can't share this funding with you, or if you're permanently closed or in a bankruptcy proceeding, which makes sense. So that's some key information on eligibility there. I will note one question that I have gotten quite frequently since we published our draft guidelines was in relation to if your business had a transfer of ownership over the last couple of years. If that is the case for you, if you are able to submit the 2019 and 2021 tax filings, which we'll talk about here momentarily, I might be getting a little ahead of myself. But if you had a change of ownership during that time, as long as you have access to those tax filings and have some sort of documentation, we're trying to define what that documentation looks like. Probably a contract of sale, but documentation of that sale there, you should be fine in eligibility. So I know that has come up a lot, and I like to mention it on here because it makes a big difference for folks, especially if you're in that in between when you took over a business right as a pandemic was about to hit. I know how hard that can be, and we definitely still want to help you. It's not your fault that a pandemic hit. Okay, so when it comes to award amount, I mentioned before, we have $10 million for this grant, and $2 million of it is reserved for those minority or women-owned businesses. And that is not a cap, it's just a reservation for them to make sure that they are able to get the support that they need. Oftentimes, some of our minority and women-owned businesses across the state are a lot of times they fall into that micro business category. So they're pretty small and they don't have as many resources potentially to get that application in quickly with it being first come, first served. So we definitely want to support those folks as we distribute these funds. So if we run out of that $2 million there, that does not mean that our minority and women-owned businesses are no longer have any funds. They'll just go into that other $8 million that we have available. Just a reservation, not a cap. Regardless of which pot you fall into there in this award amount, we're awarding up to $25,000. And that is where the tax filing information comes in that I've referenced a couple times here. So in this situation, we are looking at decreased revenue or gross receipts. That's one of the stipulations from Treasury for us to be able to award funds. So we're having our applicants demonstrate that by submitting their tax filings, and we're looking for a decrease in gross revenue and receipts in 2019 compared to 2021. So again, if we end up going down the path of including 2020 businesses in there, then it will be your 2019 or 2020 taxes compared to your 2021. And that 2019 number, that is critical that we establish a baseline to show how you are operating pre-pandemic to then be able to show the effect in 2021. So the loss there that's how we tie it back to COVID, because everything has to be tied back to COVID with our ARPA funds. So again, number 2 on there, on that note, we also will be asking for a narrative statement explaining how your business was negatively economically impacted by the pandemic. So if you're able to demonstrate that loss there in your tax filings, it's likely you know what happened and what caused that for your business. For example, I was speaking with a woman the other day who owns a auto mechanic shop. And she was saying that, you know, our business was really hurt because think about it, you know, people weren't going into work, they weren't traveling, they weren't doing anything. So there were less vehicles on the road. Well, there's less maintenance needed if you're not putting any miles on your vehicle. There's less accidents if there's less people on the road. And so that obviously really affected their business. So that's what we're looking for there in that situation, for that statement. We just, again, have to tie everything back to COVID to make sure that we are abiding by those federal guidelines there. So I have a couple examples here. I know it's pretty simplistic, but I'm a visual learner and I know I'm not the only person like that. So to see some examples is usually pretty helpful for folks. So I have two of them here. The first one being Bonnie's Flower Shop. These are just made up businesses. But in their tax filings, for example, in 2019, we had a gross revenue and receipts of $70,000 compared to 2021, which was 40, which equals a $30,000 total loss. So if you remember, we are reimbursing for up to $25,000 of demonstrated loss. So even though they're able to prove $30,000 of loss, we're reimbursing for 25. On the flip side of that, with example number 2 there, you'll see we have a total loss of $10,000. So their total reimbursement would be $10,000 because that's what they were able to demonstrate. So they wouldn't get the full 25 in that situation because they weren't able to show proof of that. So hopefully that gives a little more context there and makes sense. I know when we get into the nitty-gritty of this, it can be a little confusing for folks. And if it's still confusing, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I am here to answer questions. I was saying earlier, I have 20 emails in my inbox from folks just like you who are listening, asking questions. So feel free to do that. That's what I'm here for. Okay. If there's a screen that you would like to take a picture of or a screenshot of, this would be the one. This is the required documentation. So these are all the kind of your checklists there of everything you will need to have prepared to submit your application in October when that time comes. Most of it's pretty standard across all of our ARPA programs. It looks more intimidating than it actually is. Excuse me. I know when I was not familiar with SAM2 vendor ID number and filling out the vendor input form, when you hear that, it sounds really involved and like it's going to take a ton of time, which I know is difficult when you're running a small business, especially if you're a one-man show and running everything for your business. The last thing you have is a ton of extra time to dedicate to filling out all this information. I will tell you that we have trimmed this list down as small as possible. I have been a bulldog for that because in my previous role working at the Chamber of Commerce down in Cape Girardeau, I worked a lot with our small businesses and I know how limited your time is. So I've tried really hard to make this list as minimal as possible for y'all. But back to that SAM2 vendor input form, that looks like something that may take 30 minutes long. I don't know when you're looking at that. It's actually just about a 10-minute form to fill out. So it's not as daunting as it looks. So don't be scared, but also don't procrastinate either because time is of the essence with this grant being first come, first served. So I would encourage you, if you have an accountant, that you might want to reach out to your accountant and look at your tax filings and see if you have that loss there, able to demonstrate, and start familiarizing yourself with these forms and start working on those, because this will definitely be the required documentation. If anything we would add to it, we won't take away from this list. So like I said, all this is pretty standard for most of our programs, except for the last 3 are pretty specific to the small business grant. So we're looking for employer withholding form 941 for your proof of employee count there, or your quarterly state unemployment form showing your number of employees. Your tax filings, which you might notice if you happen to be a farmer listening in on this, the Schedule F filed with Form 1040, that's I believe what our farmers fill out, that's being added to the list as well. We want to make sure that we include all of our small businesses regardless of industry that you're in. So don't be concerned. And if there is something on here on this second to last list there of all of those tax filing forms that you notice might be missing, please let me know. I think we have it mostly covered, but we certainly don't want to miss out on anyone. We mentioned that narrative statement already, and I think that's all of the required documentation. There might be one other thing. There's something sticking in my brain there that there might be one other thing that we're adding to that list, but it's not coming to me right now. So I'll let you know if it comes back to me. But otherwise, that's the required documentation we're looking at for this grant, and would really encourage you to start familiarizing yourself and start filling out some of those forms if you have the time available. I keep mentioning that time is of the essence here with this grant. So I would really encourage you to subscribe for updates on our website. If you go to ded.mo.gov/ARPA, you'll see that left-hand screenshot there. That red circle, that's where you would click to subscribe for our updates. You'll put in your email address and then you'll see that right screen grab, the quick subscribe. If you want information on all things going on within DED, you can check all the boxes, but I will warn you, you'll get a lot of emails, all great information, but sometimes you just don't want your inbox cluttered. So if that's the case for you, I would really encourage you to check that small business grant program updates box and just leave it at that. You're looking at signing up for about 5-ish emails over the next month. So we'll let you know when the final guidelines are published and ready for you to look at. That's going to be your Bible in this situation. It's going to tell you the final eligibility requirements, all that required documentation, everything that you need to know to study up for this application. That's the end product there. So final guidelines, we'll send you a checklist with all that required documentation. It's my intention right now to, once we have our application built out and ready to go, for me to go through and kind of record walking through that application so you know exactly what you're looking at. You're not going in blind. So we'll probably send that recording out along with a reminder of when applications are opening, and then one final note when the applications are actually open. So again, about 5 emails, then we won't ever bother you again. So I would, again, really encourage you to sign up for that, because that way you won't miss out on this opportunity for sure. And I might ask the chamber to maybe share that information out with the membership as well, in case any folks miss this recording here. I think it's really valuable information there. With that, I have a couple resources here. Obviously, a link to the draft guidelines. This is the most current information we have out and published. Like I said before, we're looking at publishing our final guidelines here in the next couple of weeks. So that will be updated. That link will be outdated eventually, but when it's outdated, you'll know that there's final guidelines out and to look at that instead. And of course, reach out with any questions that you might have at any time. If you wake up in the middle of the night frantic about what line on your tax filing we're looking at, or so on and so forth, or do you meet this eligibility requirement if XYZ, feel free to shoot me an email. That is what I'm here to do. I'm really happy to be working with all of our small businesses across the state, and honored to be a part of this program and this whole effort with ARPA. It's definitely I would say probably one of the biggest things I'll ever do in my career. So I'm very, very honored to be in this position to help you all out. With that, I'll open it up for any questions anyone might have. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen here if I can, if my mouse will wake up, because I like to see people's faces. But if anybody has any questions, let me know. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me after the fact.
Do you care to drop your email contact in the chat so they can get that?
Absolutely. There we go.
And so it kind of feels like it went through really fast, but so you're probably looking at having applications up and open mid-October, and then how long do you think that's going to be open for?
It's really hard to tell with it being a first come, first served grant. We're just not
Okay.
quite sure how long it's going to take to use up that funding. So we're going to leave it open, I
Okay.
think, until the funding's gone. So that would be another reason to sign up for those emails as well, because I'm sure we will. Okay, I'm 6 emails then. We will let you know whenever we're getting close or have run out of funding and close that application, but there's no specific window there.
Okay. Okay. Because I didn't know if you were just going to run like a short round and then, you know, have a closing date and then maybe try to do some later if you still had funds left. So that's good.
Hoping-
Open-ended until they're gone.
Yep, hoping to do it all in one round, just get it done.
Okay, great. I was trying to think, did you have any questions, Sue or Lucinda?
Well, this is a little off topic, but can you tell me, do you know right offhand who your counterpart is for the community revitalization grant?
Yes, it's Bradley Clark, and his email is exactly the same as mine is, bradley.clark@ded.mo.gov.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Is it Bradley Ley or just?
Yeah, I'll drop it in here in the
Okay.
chat too.
That's fine. I just didn't know if it was, because inevitably I would spell it wrong.
I understand. I was actually thinking through, I should have probably spelled that for them, just in case.
Okay. Well, I don't have any more questions. I think you pretty much covered everything. Lucinda, are you there? Did you have any questions maybe?
I didn't have any questions at this time. I appreciate your
Okay.
time and letting us know about all of this.
Absolutely. I'm certainly happy to do so. Again, if you have any other questions after the fact, or if anybody asks you questions that you don't know an answer to, feel free to reach out. Those draft guidelines are out there as a resource still, and the final guidelines will be out for access too.
Okay.
I agree. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with us. We really appreciate it. I think there'll be a lot of people watching this video.
Yes.
So, thanks.
Fantastic.
Yes.
That's what we hope. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
we do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll go ahead and just stop the recording, and I greatly appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.